Welcome to science class. Today we are going to learn about evolutionary milestones. There are something like 800,000 different insect species. Most people in America know about the bumblebee and the honeybee, but those are 2 out of 20,000 species of bee alone. Because all insects are related through evolution, we can pick a defining characteristic that they all share. An easy one is that they all have 6 legs, but we can go a bit more broad and go with an exoskeleton. Having an exoskeleton puts them in the phylum Arthropoda, which they also share with crustaceans, myriapods, which are centipedes and millipedes, and arachnids, which include spiders, ticks, and scorpions. Having an exoskeleton is a unique characteristic to arthropods. No other animals have exoskeletons. This is an example of an evolutionary milestone. Once it happened, it became more or less permanent and shaped a huge percentage of the animal kingdom. There's no limit to how many evolutionary milestones you would want to include in a video. The way I am going to construct this video is to cover evolutionary milestones that actually changed the planet. The evolution of arthropods does not make the cut for my list. There are 22 evolutionary milestones that I will cover in this video. Some of them are about the physical planet and not the evolution of life, but they still had permanent lasting effects on life on Earth. Let's get started. Throughout this video, I will be using 2 timelines. One that shows the entire history of the planet, and another that only shows the most recent 541 million years, which is a number I've selected because that's when the first complex, visible forms of plant and animal life evolved on Earth. There are things about this timeline that are hard to grasp. For one, the major timeline represents about 4.56 billion years. That is an unbelievably long amount of time. To give you an idea, if we made a real timeline and every millimeter represented a year, the timeline would stretch far beyond the width of the entire United States. If the timeline were made of time and 1 second equaled 1 year, then you would have to go backwards more than 2 years to get to the extinction of the dinosaurs and more than 144 years to the formation of planet Earth. It's crazy, I know, but that's what happens when you try to talk about billions of years. So for the record, on this timeline, which shows the entire history of Earth, that is where the dinosaur extinction goes. That's what 66 million years looks like on a 4.5 billion year timeline. Okay, let's jump into this. Earth formed in space out of meteorite-like materials. At first, Earth was nothing but a molten sphere, but the crust of the Earth finally stabilized and hardened. This milestone was crucial because now Earth's surface was cut off from the heat of its interior. Life could never have evolved on a planet that is as hot as the early Earth was. This milestone also allowed the second milestone to occur. Before Earth had a solid crust, all of Earth's water was in the atmosphere. It was too hot for liquid water. The establishment of permanent surface water on Earth was yet another crucial milestone in the evolution of life. Water is the most common compound of any living organism, and water is a fabulous material for dissolving materials and performing chemical reactions. We're not sure exactly when, but around 3.7 billion years ago, the earliest forms of life evolved on Earth. It's impossible to know exactly what this life form was like, but they would have definitely contained DNA and RNA, they would have been housed inside of a membrane, and they would have been unicellular. It appears most likely that the first forms of life would have had a chemosynthetic metabolism. These cells would not have consumed organic, living material, but rather they would have extracted energy the way other chemosynthetic archaea do, which live around hydrothermal vents. The 4th evolutionary milestone, according to me, is the most significant thing that ever happened on Earth, and that's the evolution of photosynthesis around 3.5 billion years ago. First of all, the basis for all food, for all organisms on Earth, depends directly on photosynthesis, apart from very small exceptions in extremely specialized environments. Second, photosynthesis produces free molecular oxygen. Oxygen, as we learned a long time ago, is an extremely good molecule for transferring energy. The Krebs cycle, which all eukaryotes and many bacteria rely on for energy extraction, can't happen without oxygen. The amount of ATP made when oxygen is available versus when it is not is many times greater. Complex, multicellular life could never have evolved without photosynthesis. Think of a planet that has life all over its surface, but all of that life is unicellular and prokaryotic. That world would likely appear to be lifeless without a deep investigation. The oxygen produced by photosynthesis also drastically changed the physical Earth. Oxygen is the most abundant element in Earth's crust by far, but there are no geologic processes that make pure oxygen. Only photosynthesis does that. Early Earth likely only had around 250 different minerals until abundant free oxygen became available. Today we know of at least 5,000 different kinds of minerals, and oxygen is central in the vast majority of them. The availability of free oxygen took a very long time to accumulate. At first, all the pure oxygen made by photosynthesis quickly reacted with iron and other materials to form compounds. Then it began to become dissolved into the oceans. But eventually, all of the oxygen that could be absorbed in those ways was, but it kept being produced. This led to the sixth evolutionary milestone, which is the oxygenation of the atmosphere, which occurred around 2.5 billion years ago. Pure oxygen had never existed in Earth's atmosphere before, and now today it makes up 21%. The importance of oxygen in the air for life should be obvious, so we don't need to go into that in more detail. The next evolutionary milestone is the second most important in the history of biology, according to me, and that's endosymbiosis. As I talked about earlier, complex multicellular life couldn't possibly exist on Earth without oxygen and the Krebs cycle to thoroughly extract energy from food. This means that complex life requires chloroplasts and mitochondria. The origins of mitochondria and chloroplast are that they used to be prokaryotes. Sometime between 1.6 and 1.4 billion years ago, a large prokaryote engulfed a smaller one. Bacteria have photosystems and do photosynthesis very closely to the way chloroplasts do. They also do the Krebs cycle very closely to the way mitochondria do. Perhaps the first time this occurred, a large bacteria that metabolizes carbohydrates engulfed a small photosynthetic bacteria. Instead of digesting it, for whatever reason, the photosynthetic bacteria stayed alive, and the larger host bacteria was able to use the oxygen and sugars it produced to be self-sustaining. In very simple terms, this is what algae and plants do. Similarly, a bacteria that metabolizes carbohydrates likely engulfed another, much smaller bacteria that does the same, and used it to burn extra carbohydrates for extra energy. The mitochondria in your cells do that with the food you eat. They're the ones that actually extract the energy from it. There are multiple lines of evidence for this. First of all, mitochondria and chloroplasts exist sort of independently from the rest of your cell. They have their own DNA, they have their own RNA, and they make a few of their own proteins. They also divide by binary fission. Cells can't make their own mitochondria or chloroplasts. They make themselves. Finally, the DNA sequences of chloroplasts and mitochondria are more similar to specific bacteria species than they are to the DNA sequences of the organism that they exist in. Over hundreds of millions of years, these organelles have physically evolved and become modified to the point where they aren't true prokaryotes anymore. Endosymbiosis then leads to the next two important evolutionary milestones. Only a few million years after endosymbiosis took place, the first true eukaryotes evolved. Then around 1.5 billion years ago, the first multicellular organisms evolved. The first multicellular organisms could not have been classified yet as plants or animals. They were too simple. In order for an organism to be a plant or animal, it must have specialized tissues. The first multicellular organism could have been similar to some kinds of algae that exist today, but it's not likely that we will ever know. Of all the milestones we will cover, this is the third of the big five, as I call them, to happen. I already said this, but again, think if Earth was covered with life, but all of it was unicellular. How different would that planet look? No plants or animals, no soil, no green that you can see from space, none of that. The ninth evolutionary milestone, and the fourth of the big five, is sexual reproduction, which occurred around 1 billion years ago. Life had existed at this point on Earth for 2.5 billion years, but life was unicellular for almost all that time, and even the eukaryotic multicellular life was still evolving very slowly. Without sexual reproduction, organisms go on making clones of themselves. The variability in offspring from fusing genetically unique sex cells together is the catalyst of evolution and speciation. The way sexual reproduction influenced life on Earth is like the difference between doing math with an abacus versus doing math with a computer. The rate at which you can now do things not only is drastically faster, but it keeps getting faster over time rather than being stuck at a constant rate. Okay, we still have 13 evolutionary milestones to cover, but the rest are actually pretty insignificant compared to the ones we have already gone over. Mostly because the following milestones could not have happened unless the previous milestones occurred. So they lose their fundamental importance because of that. I'll be very brief with all of these. We're going to zoom in on our timeline and look at just the past 541 million years, which is an eon known as the Phanerozoic, which we still live in, and it begins with the evolution of complex multicellular life. Very early on, arthropods, chordates, and fish all evolve. The first organisms you could call animals evolved slightly earlier in a period known as the Ediacaran, such as Dickinsonia. Yeah, I know, don't laugh. I could basically end the video right here, but I want to cover some other minor plant and animal milestones. Plus, we still have the fifth big milestone. I already discussed arthropods, but again, they are the most abundant animals you can see with the naked eye. Chordates are the ancestors of all vertebrates, plus a few other organisms. Fish evolved so long ago and are so diverse that the word fish is actually not a good word to classify them. You know how we say birds are dinosaurs? That's because birds evolved directly from dinosaurs, making them part of what's called the dinosaur clade. Other reptiles, like crocodiles, evolved before dinosaurs. This means that an ostrich is more closely related to T-Rex than a crocodile. And because fish were the first vertebrate animals, that means that we and all other vertebrates are part of the same clade as them. You are a fish in that sense. In fact, sharks, which are cartilaginous, are less closely related to the bony fish, such as a walleye, as you are. That is really weird. The last of the big five evolutionary milestones occurred around 470 million years ago, and that was the evolution of land plants. Now that plants existed on land, other forms of life could eventually colonize it too. For tens of millions of years, there was abundant multicellular life in the oceans, but no life on land. About 100 million years later, the first angiosperms evolved, which are plants that produce unprotected seeds, typically in the form of a cone. Amphibians become the first large land animals to begin living on land. A group of animals called the synapsids evolved. This was 330 million years ago, long before dinosaurs evolved. Synapsids were really weird, and the most famous synapsid is Dimetrodon. Not only is Dimetrodon not a dinosaur, it's not even a reptile. Reptiles and synapsids diverged from a common ancestor at around 330 million years ago, and mammals eventually evolved from the synapsid lineage. Life was evolving and branching into the most ecologically diverse state ever on the planet, but then it almost all ended. 252 million years ago. For reasons that are hard to pinpoint exactly, the worst extinction for complex life ever occurred. It's called the Permian extinction, and 96% of all ocean species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species went extinct. Entire genera of animals, such as the sea scorpions, trilobites, acanthodians, and blastoids, went completely extinct, and many others saw a 90 to 99% reduction. All living things we see today are the descendants of the few plant and animal groups that made it through this extinction. That extinction opened up a huge number of ecological niches that were then filled by the dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and various groups of aquatic reptiles. Birds evolved at the end of the Jurassic era, around 150 million years ago. 125 million years ago, angiosperms evolved. Angiosperms are flowering plants, and today 80% of all plant species are angiosperms. Their evolution and coevolution with insects, where they have adapted to mutually benefit or try to repel one another, has been a massive force for diversification. The final evolutionary milestone is the extinction of the dinosaurs, which, like the previous Permian extinction, opened up niches that allowed mammals and birds to rapidly evolve and diversify. There's a lot of conversation around whether or not the evolution of humans is as significant of a milestone as the Big Five that I mentioned in this video. We have changed the composition of the atmosphere, but not by much. But that slight change is leading to other planet-wide changes. Extinctions don't happen in an instant. They take millions of years sometimes. But in the last few centuries, we have seen the rate of extinctions of animals greatly accelerated for reasons tied to human activity, such as the terraforming of the planet for agricultural purposes, the warming of the atmosphere and the oceans, and the acidification of the oceans, as well as overhunting and overfishing. For example, the passenger pigeon used to be one of, if not the most abundant birds in the world. As many as 5 billion of them existed in North America. Reports from the late 1800s described flocks of passenger pigeons 500 kilometers long that took 14 hours to fly by. Then in 1914, they became completely extinct. There is also pretty clear fossil evidence that as soon as humans colonized new land masses, such as Australia and the Americas, the megafauna, such as mammoths, all went extinct relatively soon afterwards. Humans changed the planet faster than any natural process besides a meteorite impact possibly can. Just look at satellite imagery of Earth, and you can see how we've made the landscape into something that it simply didn't used to be. But we don't know the future. Right now, you can't say that we are coexisting with the rest of life on Earth. The majority of species on the planet are worse off than they were before humans spread to all of the good continents. But one day, we might find balance, as long as we take a conscientious, scientific approach to solving the problem. In the next video, we're going to begin studying populations of organisms and seeing how they change over time through evolution. Thanks for watching.